The Russian saw the drone coming down over him, jumped into a ditch to escape without seeing how the machine flew toward a comrade. The Ukrainians began to surround some of Moscow's small assault groups. The Russian soldiers marched with courage, but several of them were assigned to attack the worst positions. Among them was Dmitry Ivanov, a young man who had been at war for months with no prospect of making it back alive to his son. Dmitry Sergeyevich Ivanov was once again trapped inside a basement, waiting for the drones to stop flying over his head. So he decided to record a message to alert Moscow and anyone else who could hear about his brigade's situation. The bitter words rang out, telling the truth, unsure whether anyone would listen or whether ideology or fanaticism had already deafened them. They would ignore what was happening to the soldiers who fought for what men behind sofas and screens claimed was their cause too. The war in Ukraine had already completed 4 years. The maps looked fine. Day after day, it was possible to see the Russian advances on the front lines. More regions were taken, flags were raised in destroyed villages, and small clusters of 20 to 200 houses were counted as major gains. The Russians had the initiative, and for years the situation had not been favorable for the Ukrainians. There were few soldiers on the front line. Kyiv's defensive positions could not be properly manned. Men suffered for days and months without rotation, enduring artillery strikes, being hunted by drones, and having to deal with wave after wave of small Russian assault groups. Those who survived brought home the exhaustion of their bodies and the scars of war on their spirits. And not all the technology developed in the last 4 years had yet replaced the need for men to occupy defensive positions. And that the Russians had in abundance, recruiting and sending everything they had to the front. That's why Dmitry Ivanov was fighting in the 30th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade of the 72nd Motor Rifle Division of the 44th Army Corps. They advanced for months in the direction of Uliaipol. The fighting was long, passing through Donetsk and heading towards Zaporizhzhia. They gained territory continuously for months, but so much time in battle took its toll. Dmitry Ivanov had a lot to say about the fate of commanders with Sever or about what happened to his friend from Kyiv, all because of people like Bryansk. While Dmitry Ivanov was recording his message, the Ukrainians were using new weapons developed during the war to try to strike the Russians on their own territory. In Novorossiysk, the Ukrainian attack hit one of the most sensitive points of the energy infrastructure in the Black Sea. Information that became public indicated damage to loading and storage facilities connected to the Caspian pipeline terminal, while Ukraine itself also struck. Dmitry Ivanov said it was just fire or a visually impressive destruction. The weight of this type of attack was in its impact on the operational logic of the Corps, in the ability to move oil, in the risk to export infrastructure. And what about the economic effect that such a blow produces when it falls on a strategic energy hub? What do we have here? A shoulder. Meanwhile, the Russians used the frigate Admiral Makarov, which launched its Caliber missiles against Ukrainian cities. The projectiles were widely used to destroy the Ukrainian power grid and command centers, demonstrating a range that varied between 1,500 and 2,500 kilometers. Because they were cruise missiles and flew at low altitude, they were able to navigate around terrain and avoid radars. The Ukrainians tried to counterattack using their FP-1 drones, a new technology that on several occasions had managed to get past Russian defenses. Two targets were the frigate Admiral Makarov and the floating platform Sivash. Unlike regular FPV drones that operated on the front line, the FP-1 was designed for deep strike missions. It had an impressive range of up to 1,600 kilometers. This allowed Ukraine to strike oil refineries, air bases, and ammunition depots deep inside Russian territory. Its cost was estimated at around $55,000, an amount considered negligible compared to cruise missiles that cost millions. In addition, its payload capacity allowed it to carry warheads of up to 113 kilograms, making it a lethal weapon against structural targets. Dmitry, which allowed the
Ciência vitamínica fundamental para a manutenção de neurônios, imaginassem que alguém estava dizendo que a Ucrânia could reach. Ela estava simplesmente reagindo, sobrevivendo.
Oil, airfields, depots, ammunition deep inside Russian territory, which allowed the
Guerra não era filme de Hollywood, como os norte-americanos
could reach, making it a lethal structural target, allowed Ukraine to target oil, making them structural targets. Soldier Ivanov lived through all of this and tried to warn people far from the war, comfortable on their sofas, about this truth. What? Dmitry Ivanov was 22 years old when he started fighting for the 30th Motorized Rifle Brigade on the Uliaipol front in 2025. He saw all the advances, fighting in the summer, in the autumn, and in the winter. He learned how the drones chased the Ukrainians inside the villages, clearing the way for him and his comrades to follow Commander Server's orders to take those positions. It wasn't easy, but at least faced with all these problems, Server called in artillery such as the 2S-3 Akatsiya to cover for the infantry. The 152mm self-propelled howitzer kicked up mud as it tried to get into position. The crew knew they could be targeted by drones. The standard model had a range of about 17 to 20 kilometers, and the modernized versions, which used rocket-assisted munitions, could reach almost 25 kilometers. All of it was well within the range of Ukrainian drones during that year of the war. Even so, they bravely followed orders, firing and blowing up targets along the tree line. Artillery fire was heavy that winter. Ivanov relied both on the team's gunfire and on the drones to bring fire down on the Ukrainians. He himself saw little of these enemies during all that time. Almost the entire war was fought at a distance. With men exploding in the fields, remains appeared in the path of the Russian soldiers as they took positions. Sometimes they went to clear trenches that had only twisted corpses left by the FPVs and the bombs. Ivanov had been dissatisfied for some time. His salary hadn't been paid for months. And it even felt personal to him, since he had a child to take care of in Russia and knew of others who were getting paid. Besides, without that, the assault groups were always there. As long as Server was in charge, men like him and his friend Dicky still felt safe. But he feared he would have to deal with Briandes and others who demanded the infamous bribe to stay alive so they wouldn't be sent on the most dangerous assault missions. Of course, the 30th Russian Brigade kept fighting non-stop. Even with so many problems, Server still kept the troops' morale up. Over 3 to 4 months of non-stop fighting, the Russian forces declared victory in the Battle of Uliaipol in January 2026, capturing the city and 42 nearby villages in the provinces of Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk. Ukrainian aviation eliminated many of Ivanov's friends during those months of the campaign against Uliaipol. The explosions in the buildings turned assault groups into piles of stinking corpses.
Pedendo sobre os escombros.
Those who survived had to face unexpected enemies. What seemed like a fictional scenario, ground drones patrolled some of the villages, carrying Browning 12.7mm or PKT 7.62mm machine guns. One of the soldiers tried to fight against the threat, but so many heavy rounds flew past him that they forced him to retreat, already wounded, into a house, where he just waited for death, A heavy Baba Yaga drone flew over the hideout. With each explosion, the Russian felt death getting closer, until finally the cold made him sleep the eternal sleep. That man died without a single soldier setting foot on the ground to surround and kill him. Gradually, problems started piling up in the 30th Brigade as Ukrainian drones began exploding both on the front line and in the rear. Yes, a lot had worked for the Russians, but the suffering of the soldiers, eternally underestimated in exchange for victories in villages for the commander's reports, began to take its toll. Serva and Diki tried to take action, but Bryansk was there, starting a conversation with Moskva that would change the fate of the company. The first drone exploded over the Ukrainians' heads. They still managed to survive, but the swarm continued the attack. And then, after that, a quick assault took over the trench. The FPVs entered the Ukrainian shelters in the direction of Uliaipol and Uriki. The Russian command believed that with the fall of Uliaipol, conditions would be created for a converging attack against Uriki, Ukraine's main stronghold, in the south, from the east and the west simultaneously, disrupting the defenses in Malak, Sherbak, and Novopavlivka. But the fall of Starlink in 2026 had been greatly hindering the Russians. Without fast and accessible internet, drone support was reduced. The Ukrainians were taking advantage of this, unleashing destruction that further lowered the morale among the Russians. One of the steps was to destroy the observer drones of Moscow's troops. The Russian army tried to migrate vital communications to Gazprom Space Systems terminals and operated through the Yamal satellite constellation. However, the broadband of these geostationary satellites proved insufficient for uninterrupted and stable video transmission, a non-negotiable requirement for modern warfare operations based on drones and FPVs. Despite the promise of a constellation of Russian satellites in low Earth orbit, conceived as a direct rival to Starlink, its initial launch suffered chronic delays, leaving the Russian command post blind and operationally inefficient during the crucial weeks of the Ukrainian offensive push. Another step was the quick and well-planned assaults. The soldiers of the 33rd Assault Regiment surrounded the houses where men like Ivanov and Avil were taking shelter. Inside, there was sometimes only 1 or 2 soldiers sent to test the defenses. They were cornered by Ukrainian fire, with little to do until grenades turned their fear and inaction into an eternal fall onto Ukrainian soil. After the explosion, more ammunition entered the house. The all-clear signal was only given after confirmation shots landed on a body that no longer reacted. The squad moved on to the other one. The same encirclement had to be carried out carefully. The magazines were emptied sparingly onto the Russians. They were emptied. Artillery fire took care of what only rifles and grenades couldn't handle. The ceiling collapsed.
Paredes desapareceram.
The impacts killed some, but an armed and wounded soldier could jeopardize the entire assault. The drones flew in to carry out a more thorough sweep. Only after them did more soldiers approach with their rifles pointed into the ruins. The soldier looked carefully until he confirmed the last man was dead. Those assaults were persistent against Striver's men. There, Ivanov saw many of his brothers killed by the Ukrainians after being surrounded in areas where the advance had been too hasty. The Russians had created a trap for themselves, one that the Ukrainians themselves seemed not to have planned. Their strategy adapted to an active defense, based on the elastic absorption of the impact on the enemy, and the rapid triggering of the strategy adapted elastic absorption based on an active defense enemy.
Highly mobile, so many problems led the leaders. The strategy and active defense based on the rapid triggering enemy. Adapted based on elastic absorption, rapid triggering enemy. Contou que os dois foram enviados, juntamente com muitos de seus colegas, and on the rapid triggering of active elastic, the strategy adapted to the strategy absorption, proteção além da esperança de encontrar uma trincheira abandonada para se abrigarem.
But just that wasn't enough, because the assault had to continue, and the drones were there to collect the soldiers' toll. It was either his sweat or his life. The explosions broke the men who didn't make it to shelter during a quick chase among the dry trees at the end of winter. Afterwards, they visited the soldier who had managed to hide. Sometimes, a man managed to jump into the ditches, saving himself from being the first target. The drones wanted the first, easiest target so they wouldn't waste flight time. The less fortunate soldier felt the explosion. The rest of the swarm arrived later, continuing the series of detonations that gradually wore down the squad's resistance, leaving men in agony on scorched fields. Some even made it to the village, gathering in the houses, preparing to receive new orders. That was part of the tactic. Small groups entering through gaps, then joining up with a larger force. Once discovered by the Ukrainians before they could launch the assault, they became a target that made drone pilots smile. Ivanov recounted in his desperate account that he sensed his turn to die was coming as the assault groups became costly and increasingly deadly. To make matters worse, Bryansk was immediately promoted from major to colonel after sacrificing Server. Moskva, who was close to Bryansk, quickly took over the vacant position of deputy commander. The orders from both of them only got worse. The Russian attacks continued killing and injuring Ukrainians. Equipment was destroyed, territories were captured, but the cost for the infantry soldier was too high. Ivanov reported that without the former commanders, anarchy, chaos, and abuse took over the company, which was hidden by reports of victories. Even so, the fighting continued. The artillery was firing. There was no way the Ukrainians could say those were easy months, even with the few advantages they had received. In a reckless decision, a Russian commander ordered a mechanized assault on Uliaipol. It seemed like a good idea to use the fog to launch a mechanized attack. It had been a while since those vehicles had moved in a line toward Uliaipol. Even in the fog, the vehicle's thermal signature was quite visible to the Ukrainians. The heat signatures on the ground only increased when the Baba-Yaga drone dropped the heavy explosives. The slow movement of the assault group made the drone's job easier. The Ukrainians had left several of them ready as soon as the movement of the vehicles was detected. Since each Baba-Yaga could carry many charges, it was easy to drop them on the mechanized assault, turning an assault group into smoldering wreckage in the middle of the field. The kamikaze drones began to buzz over what was left of the attack. The result became clear through their lenses when the fog lifted, leaving the columns of smoke to mark the Russian failure as long as there was something left to burn. Da Subah. A lone soldier survived the massacre, lost, and next to the equipment, he was visited by his own kamikaze drone. Events like this shook the 30th Brigade. Many soldiers abandoned their posts and deserted, while others suffered retaliation, being forced to join assault units. Ivanov managed to escape, transferring to the 38th Guards Brigade of the 35th Army. Still in the Zaporizhzhia region, they didn't want him to be transferred to that brigade, but he couldn't stay, knowing very well what his fate would be. The climate of retaliation persisted there. He knew that some of his former comrades would soon become corpses, while the commanders would celebrate captured villages over hot coffee at their bases. His anger was so great that he claimed he wanted to shoot his commanders in the knees if they dared to show up on the front line. But until then, all he could do was fulfill his contract and try to survive. Meanwhile, far away, many people were still much more concerned about flags in villages than about his life and the lives of his comrades. But for those who aren't on the ground, bleeding, freezing, or starving, war is easy and a brave duty under flags on lands marked by gunpowder.